Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first ever WorldKidLit live event on this second day of WorldKidLit month. We're so happy to have everyone here in this virtual space, even though we can't all see each other. So today's event is Making Kidlit Travel, How Translations Happen. And I, Marcia Lynx Qualey, am joined by Radhika Menon, who's publishing director at Tulika Books, Charlotte Ryland, who's director of Stevens Bender Trust, Shelley Tanaka, who's an author, translator, instructor, and an editor at Groundwood Books in Canada, and Emma Wright, who is the founder of Emma Press. So thanks everyone for coming. And just for everybody who's in the audience out there, I want to say that you can at any time that a question occurs to you, you do not need to hold it in. Go ahead and type it there in Facebook, and then Ruth Ahmedzai Kemp will be gathering the questions. And of course, I would just need to mention that Mohini Gupta has put all of this together and is the backbone of this event. So we're going to start out by just each person giving a brief introduction of their work and how it relates to children's literature and translation. And I am just going to go alphabetically. So that means you, Radhika, are up first. So Radhika is the publishing director of Tulika Books, and she said during our test call yesterday that Tulika Books publishes in only 9 languages, children's books in only 9 languages. When Radhika founded Tulika Books in 1996, she was pioneering a new wave of children's publishing in India. It was the only independent mainstream publisher in the country producing books in 8 Indian languages as well as English. So Radhika is not only closely involved in all elements of the production, design, marketing of Tulika Books, but also in other initiatives in children's publishing writ large. So Radhika, if you could just give us a sort of a brief introduction to what you do and how it relates to translating children's literatures.
Hello everyone. Very happy to be here. And thank you, Marcia. Thank you, Mohini, for organizing this kind of a session and discussion. Really looking forward to it. And yeah, like Tulika is 24 years old now. We are based in Chennai in the south of India. And we are a multilingual children's publishing house, and we publish in 9 languages, which includes English, because we see English as an Indian language, and apart from English, 8 other languages. And we didn't start with all the languages. We started with about 3 and then went on to add the other languages, because when we started, we were really reacting to the colonial education system we all grew up in, which was predominantly English and English medium schools with English books, which means imported books with Western themes and Western names and ideas, and nothing to do with India. And for us, that was the reality. And so it was, this lack of Indian books rooted in the Indian context, that really that was a void we hoped to fill, and realized that if we were going to do books that reflected the multicultural, multilingual reality of India, it had to be in different languages. It couldn't be in just one language. And apart from which, of course, children, when we are talking about books for very young children, well, it's natural that they look at books in their own languages, or are introduced to books in their own languages. And it was with this that we started publishing in the languages too, apart from English. We started with the bilingual, dual language books, simply because well, you're introducing, we are aware that, well, we're primarily publishing for an English readership, yes. We are all English speaking, and that it was kind of natural to us to publish in English, but with another Indian language was a way of introducing the very young readers, or even babies and toddlers, to books that had one familiar language, and through that you introduce them to another language. It could be either way, the one's own language, or English, and so that's how we started. Not a great start, in the sense very discouraging the market, very new concepts, and so we then we continued. We were very convinced that that's the way to go, and we continued publishing, introducing other languages. And today we have about, say, in the 9 language or the 8 languages, we have about 300 titles in each of the languages, and maybe about 100 bilingual books, and 500 or more English. It is still predominant because we only do the language, the picture books. That is the picture books in languages, not the books for older children. And we publish for the 0 to 16 age group, as we say. So older books we don't do, 8+, we don't do in the languages. It's only the picture books that we translate into the different languages.
Thank you so much, Radhika, for introducing us to your work. So next, alphabetically, is Charlotte Ryland. And Charlotte comes to us not as a publisher, but as a part of a leader in 2 organizations that support the work of literary translation and literary translation for young readers. She is director of the Stephen Spender Trust and founding director of Queen's College Translation Exchange, both of which are dedicated to promoting language learning, multilingualism, and translation. In these roles, she aims to engage people of all ages and backgrounds in literary translation and to bring creative translation activities into UK schools. So thank you, Charlotte. And so if you could please tell us a bit more about what you do with Stephen Spender Trust and the Translation Exchange.
Sure, thank you. And thank you very much for this invitation. I'm a big fan of the blog and really impressed with what you do with WorldKidLit Month. So it's great to be involved right at the beginning. So I thought I'd just start with a bit of background of how I came to be involved in all of this and where, where my perspectives come from, which is from working with literary translation for a number of years, mainly with German literature, and promoting German literature in English translation, and then also teaching German and becoming more and more kind of interested in and concerned by what's happening in the UK in terms of language learning and a real decline in the numbers of young people learning languages, while at the same time there are really the numbers of speakers of other languages in classrooms across the country is growing, and there's a disconnect between those 2 things. And with my work with literary translation, I did lots of translation workshops and started to think that actually I could bring these 2 parts of my life together quite productively, because translating together is a really wonderful way of engaging with other languages and with other literatures. And you can do it at any age. You can do it with any level of language, right from not knowing the language at all to being fluent. And it's a really rich experience. So I started to think about ways that I could to bring these 2 things together and get young people translating. And it seems to me that there are multiple benefits when this happens, when young people translate together. Firstly, it's about raising the profile of knowing another language, and that might be a modern language that you're learning at school, or the language that you speak at home or with your grandparents or whatever. It just raises the profile of that language and shows the value of having that language. It also makes languages really fun right now, rather than in some imagined future where you might travel to that country or have a pen friend in that country. It's a really exciting encounter and experience that you can have in the classroom or in the community group or whatever right now. And then thirdly, and probably most relevant for this panel, is that it brings literature in other languages into children's lives and into classrooms. It makes it more accessible to teachers who might not know those languages. And so, yeah, for those three reasons, I'm, as you can tell, pretty convinced by it as an activity for all young people to take part in. And so I have the pleasure of running two organisations that, as you say, work in this field. I think I'll speak mainly today about the Stephen Spender Trust. I also co-founded about 3 years ago an organisation based at the University of Oxford that we call the Translation Exchange, and we get students going out to schools and running translation workshops. But the Stephen Spender Trust is a much more long-standing organisation, and the two main things that we do at the Trust are firstly to train translators to go into schools and run workshops. And those workshops are very often based on a picture book. We also do workshops on poetry, which might be children's poetry or adult poetry, pieces of prose, graphic novels. But I'd say kind of the core activity that we do is picture books, and taking the young people through this very kind of structured process whereby they might start off not knowing the language of this book, but by the end they have genuinely and collaboratively translated it into English, and in the process had a really exciting experience. And you see the kind of light in their eyes that really proves what a pleasure it's been. And then the second thing we do is we run a prize for poetry translation called the Stephen Spender Prize for poetry translation, and that has an over 18 category, but it also has now 3 under 18 categories. And this year we received almost exactly 1,000 entries from 18 and under, which was a big increase on previous years. And we're absolutely delighted by that. And it really shows that, especially in times like now, where there are limits to what you can do, limits to where you can go, translation is something that really captures people's imagination, that young people really can engage in individually and with their friends. So we're feeling quite positive about the possibilities for developing both of those activities.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Charlotte, for that great introduction. So Shelley, you're next. Shelley Tanaka is a translator herself, an author. She teaches, and she is a fiction editor at Groundwood Books in Canada, and she is also in the earliest time zone of any of us. She teaches creative writing in an MFA program for writing for children and young adults, has written more than 30 books for young readers, and translated 24 children's books from French and German into English. So hopefully Shelley can talk to us from many different perspectives about children's literature and translation. Thank you so much for joining us, Shelley.
Well, thank you. I think that one of the things about having a very long career in book publishing is that if you live long enough, you're bound to do a little bit of everything in this business, and you end up coming at books from many different angles, and you see the business change and grow. And that has happened to me with children's book translation, just like everything else. I've translated books myself for different publishers, both in Canada and abroad, but I've also acquired and edited books in translation for Groundwood Books. Mostly I acquire books in French and German because those are the languages I took in high school. And I was thinking about this, and it's interesting to consider how a background in a language among publishing professionals results in certain books being published by that particular house. And I think translators can consider this too. So Groundwood Books was founded by Patsy Aldana, who's Guatemalan born. And so the Spanish language part of the list has always been very high. Early on, she fostered relationships with different Scandinavian publishers, and that's also shown up in the list. I don't speak or read Japanese. I've never been to Japan, but I would say that my ears would perk up if I got submissions that were translated from Japanese. So recently I've also tried to bring the practice of translating children's books into my work, teaching creative writing at Vermont College of Fine Arts in the United States. One thing I would say is that I think translation maybe comes more naturally to Canadians than it does to Americans, because Canada is a bilingual country and our book industry is subsidized and set up to foster the exchange between publishers in French and English Canada. I would also say that the province of Quebec keeps those of us in English Canada on our toes, because they are way more sophisticated than we are. I think partly because they have one foot in European culture and one foot in North America. So I have taught for 12 years in this MFA program at Vermont College, and it is a program solely dedicated to writing for children and young adults. And I have seen a real growing interest among students, among emerging writers, in international stories and books in translation, both as an inspiration for their own work, as a way of reaching out and seeing international books as being inspiration for what they are doing in their own work, but also writers who are looking for a way to use perhaps a second language that they have as another way of using their creative writing skills. So the question that has come up for me is whether children's book writers may in some ways be the ideal children's book translators, and whether translating should be part of creative writing programs. So I think I've really seen the interest in translation grow on all fronts. Groundwood has always had a really clear commitment to publishing books for and about kids whose experiences are underrepresented elsewhere, including books that might at first seem unusual or different or just weird. And I think that publishers like Groundwood, Tulika, and Emma Press show that there are readers who want those books. And our challenge is to find those readers. We have no quotas in our publishing program. Sometimes the books we love appear, sometimes they don't, but books in translation have always been part of the Groundwood list. And so I took a look at how things have changed over the past couple of years. And I would say in 2019, about 10% of the Groundwood list was books in translation. 2020, it's going to be about 15%. And in 2020, it's going to be close to 25%. Most of those in French and Spanish, but also with a smattering of Hebrew, Norwegian, Swedish. I think this is partly trend and partly serendipity. I don't expect those numbers to go up, but I think it shows that those great books are somehow getting around and finding markets outside of their home countries.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Shelley. And thank you for looking up those numbers. Emma, you are alphabetically last, I'm sorry to say. Emma is, of course, the founder of the Emma Press, as you can see behind her. Emma and the press is based in Birmingham. It's a beautiful new publishing house that specializes in poetry, children's books, literary translations, and sometimes the intersection of all of the above. The Emma Press won the Michael Marks Award for Poetry Pamphlet Publishers, which I practice saying, and I think I mostly said it okay, in 2016. So Emma, if you could tell us a bit about what made you want to include translation for children in Emma Press.
Thanks, Marcia. Yeah, the Michael Marks Award is kind of the main award I'm always trying to win, and it's such an unwieldy title to say. But yeah, so the Emma Press has been going for 8 years, and I've been publishing translations mostly for children since 2017, starting with The Noisy Classroom, which is this a Latvian collection of children's poetry. And it was really children's poetry that kind of kicked me into starting. I'd been having I'd been planning to do translations for a while, and mostly I was really encouraged by Lawrence Schimmel. He's one of the co-founders of WorldKidLit Month and WorldKidLit. But it was when I started publishing books for children that I was really starting to think about the importance of translation and I guess what kind of world I wanted to represent in the books I was putting out there. And I think I'm really passionate about poetry for children, and I think, well, I wanted to bring in some other voices. I felt like there was room, there was a lot of room for different voices, different cultures, and in the UK children's poetry publishing scene especially. So that's how it started, and then I kind of learned about it along the way and felt quite empowered. I learned about how to do contracts and editing translations, and so since then I've now published 5 languages, and it's a somewhat random assortment. I think one thing I've really enjoyed about publishing translations is just all the people I meet along the way. So at the moment, because it's still quite early days with the translations, I think the languages I've published have been to do with the translators I've met or the publishers I've met. So at the moment it's Latvian, Estonian, Dutch, Indonesian and Spanish. But I'm hoping that as time goes on, it will kind of blossom out and hopefully cover the whole world. And yeah, so to pick up on what Shelley said about kind of perking up a bit when hearing about books from Japan, maybe a bit similar to me. So I'm a British, Chinese, Vietnamese, and I think just through growing up with multiple cultures and maybe not seeing that so reflected in the books that were available to me growing up, but nonetheless feeling connected to other countries. I think when I've been thinking about what my children's list will be, I'm very aware of the importance of making children feel like they're part of a global culture, and wanting to open that up, and whether that's for children who speak other languages or whether it's for children who don't but want to feel part of the world. I think that's something I'm really passionate about. And yeah, not as well as making all those connections. So purely selfishly, I really love connecting with publishers and translators across the world. I've made so many friends. I think when I started out, I wanted to find kind of the equivalent of the Emma Press in other countries, just as in kind of other kind of smallish, small publishers, maybe run by women, who are trying to do something a bit different, and I've definitely started to do that, and it's a really exciting journey to be on. So thank you to WorldKidLit for inviting me to be here amongst all these wonderful people.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. I would definitely agree. I think the people that I've met through children's literature and translation have been sort of the core of why I'm excited about this. So now we're going to move into some questions that I think we all had for each other, and then I see that there are already questions coming in from the audience. So please keep typing those into Facebook, and they will appear in my chat, and we'll turn to those questions a little bit later. So one question that that came in from Emma that I'm going to direct at Shelley was about the challenges as an editor of translations when you're editing a book from a source language that you don't know. What kind of considerations do you bring in then?
So I guess this speaks to the whole question of how children's book translation differs from translation of material for adults, and the primary consideration of the target audience. And I think it's Danny Hahn who says, it's about recreating the reading experience for the target readers. So I come at it from that perspective, from knowing the who's receiving the translation. Practically speaking, I would say that when you're not familiar with the source language, that the relationship between the translator and the author is probably more important, and particularly when it comes to fiction, it's probably necessary. A lot of the other times for us in the process, the translator and the author often collaborate through the editor. But I think in my own experience, dealing directly with the author in cases where the editor is not familiar with the source language is crucial.
Interesting. Thank you. So, and now this question is from Charlotte and then I'm going to direct it at Emma. So Charlotte had sort of brought up what can initiatives like Stephen Spender do to support the work of children's publishing children's literature and translation. What sorts of things could exist now that don't? What kinds of support would be important to you as a publisher of Emma Press?
Hi, thanks for the question. I mean, to be honest, WorldKidLit Month is a really wonderful initiative, and I'm really glad that exists and has existed for nearly the whole time I've been publishing WorldKidLit. I think it's just any initiative that increases the awareness of children's literature and international children's literature and advocates for its importance is really vital. I think it's sometimes easy for just all translations to be kind of categorized as kind of quite niche, and there's maybe kind of there's a sense of it being a bit hard. And I think it's, with my background in kind of having previously published mostly poetry for adults, it's kind of a similar thing where it's seen as kind of hard, important, but also maybe not that accessible. And I think that anything any organization does just to present children's literature in translation as something that's actually really vital, and as there's a lot of talk at the moment in children's publishing in general about the importance of diversity, inclusivity, and representation, I think translations kind of, that's something that has been there for a long time, but maybe, I think in the UK there's a sense that we sell out and don't necessarily translate, kind of bring translations in so much. And I think that having organisations like Stephen Spender Trust promoting translations in quite an accessible way to young people, I think that does really vital work. But yeah, so general gratefulness, and I think everything helps. But yeah, having September as a month.
How do you deal with that perception? Because so translations are already seen as something serious, and like maybe you do sort of like eating your broccoli, and poetry is sometimes seen as that as well. So translation, children's poetry seems like the most, even though of course children's poetry is one of the most fun genres that exists. So I mean, is there a perception that this is like much more serious than it really is?
I feel like there is, and I'm always trying to combat that in the way I'm presenting the books. And I'm always wondering what I should foreground. Should I foreground the fact that it's just a lovely book? Or should I say, well, it's also very exciting that it's a translation. This is one of the really cool things about this book. And I've been just trying different things over the years. Sometimes I'm not sure if I got it right all the time, but yeah, sometimes I think maybe I shouldn't have mentioned it at all. Like I have these books, these Vicky books, like the little Latvian picture books, and I'm still quite not sure how to tell people about them, because I think, well, they're Latvian, like, so they're in translation, but also they're poetry. It's a poem, and it's a picture book, and it's little, and there are lots of them. So all of these things are exciting, and I wonder if maybe they would have done better if I just said they're picture books. But then the fact that they were originally published in another language, that feels really exciting to me. So yeah, that's something I'd love to hear other people's views on, kind of tips about it. Maybe Radhika, about kind of how you present the fact that you're publishing books in different languages and what goes down well.
Yeah, Radhika, if you could jump in, that would be fantastic. Unmute yourself, Radhika. Radhika, you're muted.
Yeah, poetry, in fact, we have discovered down the years, translates very well into the Indian languages. Somehow it's closer uh, to children's literature in the languages. There's a lot of poetry. In fact, if you go into each of the languages, the poetry plays a large role there, and what children are introduced to first. So when we translate from, well, we are always mostly translating from English, unfortunately, not the other way so much. But what we find is the translations work better. The translators are more confident in taking liberties with the creative use of the language. There's a comfort level at which they do it, and which shows in the translation. Whereas very often picture books, what we have realized, with short sentences, few words, just few lines on a page, what we find is not natural to the Indian languages, which are far more wordy. And so when you try to translate, it's kind of staccato and or very long-winded sentences, meaning because that's the way the Indian languages, the storytelling in Indian languages go. So a sentence becomes a very long sentence in the language to convey the whole sense of it. Now, whereas in poetry, they don't seem to be restrained by that. The translators, of course, we have to find the right translators, but translates much better. In fact, we've done this book, which is, it's 54 rhymes in 18 languages, from different parts of India. So it's kind of, what we have done is taken these and translated into their nursery rhymes, so they're very short, 6 to 8 lines, and translated it into English from the different languages, and hoping that will become part of the growing up, the rhymes children grow up with, these English rhymes rather than the Western ones we have all grown up with. From Jack and Jill to Mary Had a Little Lamb to just about all the rhymes popular in the West, and so these are quite fascinating doing them, because you're talking about food, you're talking about particular kind of fish from a certain region or a flower, and the sounds from those languages are there in the English. So we're not keeping words from the languages out of it, not at all. We use the same word. So there is the sound of the language in the English rhymes, and we hope to what we think that conveys is this whole multilingual culture in which India is, and what children are growing up in. So that's what that's what we hope to do. But we have found that poetry translates well. Of course, wordplay is difficult. There's a lot of wordplay in the Indian languages. Now that's very difficult to translate. So there are challenges, but it's very exciting.
So if I'm understanding correctly, there's sort of more adaptation and more freedom in the translation of poetry than there is in the translation of prose?
The translators themselves feel less restrained with poetry rather than with prose, with picture book stories, where they tend to translate literally, and that doesn't quite flow. So the editors work quite a bit with them. And we are editors who are not familiar. We know the language. I, for instance, know Malayalam, but it's more about your ear and your response to a language, just the oral, the sound of it. So we may not be able to translate. I mean, we're not, say, English, it's far more comfortable to work in rather than the language, but we have a sense of what it should sound, because you need to be, the source language you have to be strong in which we are. So we're able to kind of guide the translation. All the editors, in fact, I mean, which is a strange thing. Ideally, you should have language editors for each language, which we don't. And but that's how we do it. And yeah, learning all the time.
Thank you, Radhika. So Shelley had a question like this about translation versus adaptation. And Emma, I'm curious what your thought on the process is, whether when you're translating children's poetry or a children's picture book, whether that's more a process of adaptation than it would be with work for adults versus, you know, a more faithful translation, whatever you imagine that as.
Yeah, shall I go? Yeah, I think I definitely agree with what Radhika said about translators maybe going a bit further with the translation of poetry. And I think that's partly because I think everyone is aware that the end readers are children, and I think the translator's instincts generally with translation is to try to get as much of the original text into the translation as possible, which is all very well and good. But I think maybe with poetry, because you're kind of constrained within the form of the poem, if you actually did that, you might end up with something that really wasn't that enjoyable a poem, and you can't really present that to children. So I think that children's poetry is a challenge, and I think the translators maybe have to kind of create a poetic voice, and they might not even be poets themselves, but the most successful children's poetry translations are where the translator has kind of gone a step further, so it's kind of beyond a translation, and they've kind of had to create the version of that poet's voice in another language, while kind of making it a poem that kind of, I don't know, a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old could enjoy. And either the translator does that, or potentially working closely with an editor who, so sometimes some of my books are translated just by a translator. So I've got a couple of books, like there's Poems the Wind Blew In, translated from Spanish by Laurent Schimmel, so that was just him. And then there was also Super Guppy by Edward van Vendel, translated from Dutch by David Colmer. And so there, they just translated them, and then I just did some kind of small edits like I would do on any poetry collection. And then some of the other ones, so like the Bicky books, they were really fiendish, because there was the additional difficulty of making sure that the poems fitted within the spreads, so the layouts on the page. So there wasn't that much room for kind of changing the form to work for the different languages. And Latvian's a slightly more compact language than English. And then there, I for most of my paired up the translators with an editor, Kate Wakeling, who's a really successful children's poet. And so it was kind of more of a co-translation, which was necessary to take it all the way to working as mini picture books. But in all those cases, I think just from talking to the poets and to the editors, they had to go quite far, and I hope that makes sense for people understanding of translation. So it's kind of like the literal, and then there'll be like more stylized, and then there's kind of even further. And I guess for children's books, my preference generally is for it to work just as a text. Like I want to know it's a translation, but at the same time I don't want it to feel like a translation. And that can be a really difficult balance. And it's something I think about a lot, because you don't want to strip out the sense that it was written in another language and another culture. But at the same time, you don't want it to be kind of turgid, or just kind of to feel really hard. And that's, I guess, that is something that's part of the collaborative process of working with the translator, with the editor, with the author, and with all of the authors I've worked with so far, maybe maybe Carmelo, not so much. Most of them did speak English, so were working on that. They were giving edits to their the translations as well. So it was a really, there were a lot of people looking over them and thinking, is this what I want? And I really valued that as well, because I don't speak any of these languages, so I was purely editing for style and readability.
Thank you so much, Emma. So we have, I see a lot of questions coming in. I'm just going to ask one more before we move to the audience questions. I'm going to reflect Shelley's question back to her. You had asked about bilingual books. I think there are probably fewer than, I don't know, I've seen previously. What do you think the value is of bilingual books? Picture books for kids?
Lately, our bilingual books have been in English and Indigenous languages. But in general, the idea with sort of languages like French and Spanish, the call seems to be for not bilingual English, French, because it runs counter to the immersion idea that you are actually not seeing something as a translation or a version of something else, but are fully immersed in the text in whatever language you're reading it. So I asked the question because it seems to be a little out of fashion, whereas intuitively you would think that bilingual books would be a great teaching mechanism, but of course it doesn't, as Emma was saying, you know, it doesn't necessarily work out best that way. And I do like the idea of, you know, this idea of the translator being part of the creative team, another creative person, and creating something that is actually a little bit different. And so Charlotte's work is just a real revelation to me that translators in the schools, of course, you know, I think we've always been a little held back from thinking about ourselves at the front of the stage. I remember for a while, children would ask me to sign their books as a translator, and I demurred. I thought it was confusing. I thought, oh no, but why not, right? Why shouldn't that be an acknowledged part of the creative product?
Charlotte, just real quick, what about you? How do you feel the role of bilingual children's literature could be in the market, or is it something that you wouldn't use?
I think there is I think there is a place for it in terms of yeah, kind of increasing accessibility. I mean, I certainly don't follow the immersion doctrine. I think we need to have a much more flexible approach to languages in the classroom and amongst young people, and you know, the sort of the immersion idea goes together a bit with the idea that you're only a linguist if you're fluent, or you're only a linguist if you're kind of aiming for fluency at some point, and you might live in the country and people might mistake you for a native speaker and that sort of thing. And I'm far more interested in an idea of you know, a linguist is anybody who engages with another language at any level, and who finds pleasure in it, and who wants to know more about that language and more about the people who speak that language. So I think there is something quite nice about a hybrid text. If it, I don't know, the bilingual thing feels a little bit old-fashioned, I suppose, the kind of facing text. But certainly I guess that is one of the things that we end up with our workshops is that, you know, you would have the original and then you would have your new creation. But a lot of what has been said, you know, really resonates with my thinking about what we're doing. And, you know, Emma saying that, you know, this idea of the image of poetry and translation, that double whammy can risk being off-putting. And I think one of the things that we found is that if you get the kids doing it almost without telling them they're going to do it, you know, just get them experiencing it, either reading it or translating it or rewriting it together or something quite active, then they will almost always love it. And that's the way, you know, to get them to become readers of poetry and readers of international poetry. And so I think, you know, it sounds like we have a really similar mission, and I think we're on a journey towards somewhere where we wouldn't have to kind of insinuate it and pretend it's not poetry or pretend it's not in translation. But I think, you know, what we're all doing is working towards that place that we've not quite reached yet.
Okay, we have really a lot of questions. So David Jacobson has put in 2 questions, so I'll just throw out both of his questions to Shelley. First, he asks, why are there fewer translations of YA? Because a lot of what we've talked about in this event, I think, is picture books, and maybe there are. I actually don't have the numbers, but and then he also asked, how do we encourage the translation and publication of less translated languages? And Shelley, you had talked about how movements in publishing can often follow the languages that people know and are comfortable and familiar with.
Stop me if I'm not answering the question, but to speak to the second point, I do think that maybe, you know, starting with translations of more familiar European languages has sort of opened the door a little bit to other languages, and now I think there is a real desire to see books in less familiar languages, to find out about different countries, about different cultures, through works that come from those countries. It is hard sometimes to find the books, because and this opens up the question of whether translators can also act as scouts, act as sort of the first range of sort of finding the books when they're traveling, books that they know, also understanding the target market to see how those might fit in, to be able to do a sample translation, to look at what comp titles might look like. I think there's an expanded role for translators in that front, because a lot of publishers and editors don't have the time. Sorry, what was the other question? You can move on.
No, the other one was about why there's not as much YA in translation.
Why there's not as much YA? I don't know. Is it because it's a good question. I'm always looking for YA. I find that in sometimes the non-North American YA is very long, and that's an issue. It's a funding issue when translations are paid by the word, and unless there are government or Goethe-Institute type organizations in place that can do it, can just put it out of the realm for most publishers. But I think we're looking. I think that door is always open.
So there is a question that I think should be for Radhika, because it says there is a very rich body of children's literature in India, but it's mostly in regional languages. Why isn't there a concentrated effort to translate these works and make them available more worldwide? You need to unmute yourself, Radhika.
We don't get too many manuscripts, very few in the languages. Yes, there is a body of literature already in the regional languages, a lot of children's literature. We are constantly looking. We have done, we've even started a series called Classics in Translation. Oh no. Yeah, Classics in Translation and Illustrated Classics for picture books. But we haven't found too many which we could publish, simply because the kind of stories in the regional languages, see, languages are so embedded in the cultures which are and comes with all those values and biases, which to translate becomes a problem in a contemporary sense. What I mean by that is, you know, there are gender biases, for caste, very casteist, the languages in itself. So when you translate for children, you know, caste, class, gender biases are there in the language, embedded in the languages. And you know, how do you translate such a text, even when it is by well-known writers? And so we haven't really found enough stories, and that's entirely our shortcoming, because I'm sure there are enough books, and if you really look for it, you will find them. But there is a problem with the kind of language use, the kind of values that are there in those stories. How do you translate it into for a contemporary audience, where in English, you know, you wouldn't the books, we certainly keep out we work around those kinds of problems, which in a language, from a language, becomes a problem because so inherent to the language. And we have found that in the most simplest of, while translating even from English into Indian language, we find the problems. For instance, just a book about, maybe I am deviating, but I'd like to make the point, it's about a cat and a dog, and we couldn't translate this into different languages because it's about a cat who thinks she's a dog. And you know, the dog is very irritated that, you know, that she's always trying to be a dog when she's not. And what we found was a gender problem, meaning when the dog is referred to as she, then in the Indian language it has to be a certain word for the female dog, and which is not a polite word as words for females tend to be. It's you know, and how do you use it, and the whole language thing, because you just have about 100 to 200 words in a book like this, you know, and within that you can't explain anything, but you have to kind of go with the flow of the language, and this is at a very simple level, and we find that problem coming up very often with the text in the regional languages, even for children. So that's one of the problems that we face in getting Indian language books translated into English.
Thank you, Radhika. I really appreciate that. So there's a question from Alexandra Buchler that builds on what Shelley was just talking about a minute ago about, and I'm going to direct it at Emma, about the role of subsidies, domestic and from abroad, translation grants. What role, how important are they? What role do they play in making publishing commercially viable?
Thanks, Alexandra, for the question. I'd say they're really important. I think especially for picture books or longer books, I think in those cases, it would be very hard for a small publisher to raise the money up front, to pay a translator, say, to translate quite a big novel, for example, or to print a full colour picture book. And I think it just definitely takes some of the edge off the risk. I think, well, just to explain a bit about how very small publishing works, all the costs kind of come into the publisher, the small publisher. So I'm having to pay for the printing costs, which might have to be upfront, or it might be 30 days after the books arrive, and then I would wait to sell the books to make that money back. So the pinch point is there, and then also I'm commissioning illustrations. That's another thing I'm paying for up front. And then if I'm paying a translator as well, all these things would happen potentially months before I saw any of the money. And that would make you think twice about doing translations, especially ones where, I don't know, say printing a full colour picture book that would cost thousands of pounds, and or translating a novel. I'm thinking of one at the moment that's coming up where I could not have afforded it, an Estonian children's novel called Oscar and the Things, which is coming out next year, and it's quite a big book, so it will be the thickest book I've ever published, and the translation costs several £1,000s, and I think I'm really excited by it, but if there wasn't a subsidy from the Estonian literature organisation, Tulika, then I wouldn't be able to afford to get it translated. And then there's also help with the translations, with the printing costs. I think also another role that those organisations kind of play is by highlighting titles. I think it can be quite daunting finding titles, and sometimes the international literature organisations, they'll produce catalogues, they'll have representatives who can talk to publishers and pick out ones that might work with them, and just kind of provide a helping hand along the way of kind of getting the book published. So I think it's a mixture of kind of helping with some of the money, and then also with kind of helping to make the whole process slightly less daunting. But obviously it depends, that does mean that some countries will have less money, so they might provide 50% of the translation costs or 25%. And in the UK, there are some places you can go for funding. So for example, Homes the Blew In by Camille Sierra Baron, you can see that's got an English Pen Award, so for the translation. And because I'm a very small publisher, I was able to get 100% translation costs, but if I was bigger, it would have, if I were a bigger publisher, I would have had to contribute some. And then other ways would be kind of through Arts Council England, perhaps through a project grant, or I think there probably are some, but I don't think there's that much for UK publishers publishing translations. So you'd have to look for what the other countries had available, and I think that can kind of skew it towards some countries that might have more generous pots of money. I don't know how it is for bigger publishers, and maybe that wouldn't play such a big role, but certainly for me, and the Emma Press is just me, then it does play quite a big part in that.
Okay, so I think we have time for just one more question, and a couple of people asked about translating poetry. How do you choose the translator? Does it have to be a poet? What are the considerations when translating poetry from one language into another? So actually, Radhika, Emma, Shelley, and anybody who wants to take that, or else I'll choose somebody like a evil teacher. But Radhika, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. We have found that when it's a poet, who's worked, who has written poetry in the language, it works very well. Of course, there are translators who are not poets, but who are wonderful with words and playing with words and so on, and they translate very well too. But yes, poets translating poetry works very well.
I just jump in. I think the amazing translations that we get in as part of this, the entries to the Stephen Spender Prize, prove that people who don't necessarily identify as poets can write poetry, can translate poetry in that way. And I think that's one of the nice things that the prize does, is it kind of gives people the opportunity to try it out and to practice. And so yeah, I think I would, on that basis, I would say that to translate poetry well, you don't necessarily have to have written poetry before, but you may find out while translating poetry that you are a poet.
Yeah, so do you don't happen to know, teens who win the Stephen Spender Prize or are runner-up, do they go on to become translators?
All of them, yeah. Poets, no. There is, we do try to follow, and in fact on our website there is some information about previous winners, and of course they've gone on to do all sorts of things, but some of them have gone on to be translators, and some of them have gone on to be published poets as well. And lots of them report, that it's the first time they've done it, and they wouldn't have thought of doing it before, and they've obviously loved the experience, and now they're doing it in their free time, and so yeah, it's a kind of, it opens that door.
Okay, so Mohini tells me we can have one more question that we can wrap up in 2 minutes. Andrew Wong says, question from Tokyo, how much does timing play a part in the decision of whether or not you're going to take a translation when you're making that decision? So Shelley.
Timing, if that means how long it's going to take, how long the process is going to be, I would say that's not a factor if we really loved the book. I think if you really love the book, publishers are going to do whatever they can to try to make it work.
Excellent. So I will just say that there are additionally many comments on the Facebook. So anybody who's watching this later, or certainly participants, are welcome to go and read those comments as well. And we want to thank everybody so much, Radhika, Emma, Shelley, Charlotte, for participating, and Mohini and Ruth for making everything work seamlessly behind, and that we will have another discussion at the end of the month as part of the WorldKidLit Live series, and this time with working translators on their part of the process. So thank you guys all so much for coming, and we'll see you at the end of the month. Oh, I'm sorry, Mohini says to say it's September 30th at 4 p.m. British Standard Time. Thanks, everybody.